This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
I actually took both of the games on an overseas holiday with me and knocked on the door at Atari. This would have been in March of 1983. And someone from the Atari Program Exchange came out to meet me.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Eric Freeman published two programs through Atari Program Exchange, Bootleg and Weakon. Bootleg first appeared in the summer 1983 APX catalog. The catalog called it a search for booty maze game submitted from New Zealand, and it received a rare full-page description in that catalog. Weakon was only available in the final APX catalog, winter 1983. That game was later published by Antic software. I'm going to read a portion of Weakon's description from the catalog. Weakon takes you to inner space, the subatomic world of protons and photons. Use your joystick to steer your craft, shrunken to subatomic size, catch elusive Weakons, and bring them to the power generator. To survive while you search, you must dodge speeding gamma photons, clouds of ionizing radiation, and mesons that can pursue and destroy you. Once you've captured several Weakons, the particle accelerator at the bottom of your screen speeds up. Your chances of survival become slimmer, but as your score mounts, you can earn return journeys to this dangerous inner universe. This interview took place on May 26, 2016. For me, May 27th for Eric in New Zealand.
Thank you, Kevin, for inviting me to talk on your podcast.
I'm excited. I don't get too many international people, and especially people who wrote for Atari Program Exchange from out of the U.S. So this is a rare treat. I'd like to start by knowing kind of the prehistory, how you got interested in computers, what you're doing, where you're going to school, how you found the Atari. Just kind of set me up for me.
Thank you. I think when I look back, the Atari actually rescued me from what I was doing at university, which was a chemistry/science curriculum. Once I'd discovered computing, I don't think I looked back, and the Atari was part of that. I do recall finding the Atari 400 in one of our big box retail outlets and pretty much purchasing it within that day or the next day. And within a few days, I'd written some basic code on it, and then I started hunting around for better tools like the assembler language and how to program the Antic chip on the Atari. And I think I did that for pleasure initially, and it wasn't until sometime later, probably a year or so later, that I discovered you could put these programs on the Atari Program Exchange.
Tell me about the Atari scene in New Zealand. Were they readily available? It sounds like they were.
If there was an Atari scene in this part of the world, I never saw it. As far as I was aware, I was one of a handful of people who had bought the equipment here. They weren't particularly well supported. And I remember it took me some time to work out how to actually get materials that will enable me to draw sprites and use the graphics processor on the Atari, for instance. And eventually I got those as a photocopy of a photocopy from someone in the United States. So I don't think there was much of a scene. There certainly wasn't a user group, as far as I was aware. That may have come later, but I think I just worked in isolation pretty much for the pleasure of writing code on the machine.
Wow. And you said you're using the 400?
I was using the 400, although I discovered pretty early on that typing on the 400 was quite a challenge. I also had a tape drive as well to do backup, and I recall it several times, and a little roll printer. I recall several times having to re-type in all the code because it didn't back up correctly, and I would type it in diligently off my last paper printout.
Wow. So between that keyboard and the cassette drive, that's what we call doing it the hard way.
That's right, and I remember I wrote most of the first game using that because I wrote a couple of games. one called Bootleg and one called Weakon. And the first game I remember was often an exercise in frustration just because of the tools I had. But at the time, of course, I didn't know any better. At some point, I was loaned an Atari 400 by a friend who was going away on his overseas experience. Loaned an Atari 800. And that was also came with a diskette drive. And that's when I started the second game.
You said you were self-taught based on just like photocopies that you got. I mean, sounds like you didn't have access to a lot of books and magazines and stuff there in New Zealand. You were just getting what you could as you could?
Correct. I think the two documents I eventually wound up with were the 6502 assembler manual, and I'm not quite sure if that was an Atari assembler or it was part of Intel's specification. And then there was some, not complete, but some Antic documentation on how to control the graphics processor and draw sprites and move them around on the screen. And those two documents gave me all I needed.
Wow.
Well, actually, given the quality of the games, they probably didn't quite give me everything I needed. But
both your games are machine language games. So did you even try basic stuff, or did you just jump straight into machine language?
But I discovered early on that the basic that came with the machine wasn't going to do anything other than very simple programs, and so I immediately looked for an assembler so that I could control the machine code. Mm-hmm. I don't recall at the time being particularly interested in the commercial aspect of the market. I think I was just doing it for the personal challenge. Although at some point the Atari Program Exchange came onto my radar, and I actually took both of the games on an overseas holiday with me and knocked on the door at Atari. This would have been in March of 1983. And someone from the Atari Program Exchange came out to meet me. It was quite a rabbit warren of buildings at the time, a large company, as I recall, and sat me down, and I discovered a problem straight away as soon as they started to boot one of the games up. And the problem I discovered is that we have a 50 hertz power supply in New Zealand and a 60 hertz power supply in America. And everything that I was doing was trying to write code that essentially ran in little bits of a 50th of a second. And that was called the vertical blanking code, where when the screen wasn't being drawn, you tended to write most of your code or execute most of your code. And I discovered a 60th of a second wasn't long enough. So when I got back home, I had to modify it so that it ran more cleanly.
So you were on a holiday here in the United States when you went into Atari?
When I went into Atari, the individual whose name eludes me that I met with booted both of the games up, and I noticed one of them went to I guess the effective equivalent would be a blue screen today, although it managed to pop back out, and I just assumed that it wasn't getting enough time to execute its code.
So did you get it to work at all to show it off to them?
Yes, I did, and they didn't say anything, but as soon as I got back, I changed things around and sent them some new versions, and they seemed to run fine.
So I'm curious about this meeting. I mean, did you have an appointment, or did you just show up and said, "Hi, I'm from New Zealand. I brought discs"?
That's right. I guess I had the enthusiasm of youth, and I just went to their reception and asked to see someone from the Atari Program Exchange, and they kindly came out and saw me. And I remember we spent quite a bit of time walking from building to building before sitting down what was this individual's workspace, and he booted up both of the games. Subsequently, I guess he would have been one of several people at the Atari Program Exchange who were evaluating user submissions with the idea of putting them into the catalogue.
Right.
And they released both of those in 1983.
Right.
Not too long after I was there. So I think the whole thing, probably from where to go, took me around 4 or 5 weeks to send them new versions and to get them published.
Wow. And then I guess once you went home, that was all through the mail? You were just airmailing things to them?
That's right. Yep. There was no easy way, although it didn't seem like a problem at the time.
Right. So did they, other than making it work on the NTSC system, did they have any suggestions or changes they needed made?
One change, and looking back, I guess I was pretty lucky. The one change that I had was that one of my games actually used a random component that could stop you moving forward in the game if you were unlucky, and they asked me to take that out, and that was easy to do. Mm-hmm. And subsequent to that, they were both published. I then sat back and didn't think much about it, but these royalty checks for very small amounts kept popping up for a couple of years. At one point, I recall getting a $1.50 US royalty check, which I still have. Well, I was looking for it recently, and it's mislaid at the moment.
The bootleg game got a full-page description, which certainly, I think, helped you. And then, but the Weakon game appeared in the last catalog before they shut down APX. So I'm betting that didn't sell at all.
Oh, thank you. And that's all news to me. I wasn't aware that there was any difference in game sales, because the reality was not much money came in for that. I was sort of aware that the company was in some difficulty, or the APX was no longer a viable business model. But if I was just peripherally aware, and I didn't think much about it. But I would say that I made in the hundreds of dollars.
Okay.
So which is why I didn't regard gaming as my future career.
Right. Sure. And then Weakon you resold it or relicensed it to Antic software, Antic magazine software, and they might have sold a few more copies.
If that occurred, Kevin, I wasn't aware, and I don't mind. I may or may not have, but I would have just done it saying, go ahead and use it.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm curious about the rather unusual subject matter of the games, and I'd like to talk about both of them. Bootleg is a game about being a bootlegger and keeping away from the police who are trying to keep you away from your liquor, and you drive around picking up liquor bottles and things. What was the genesis of that?
Well, I wish I could remember. Or it doesn't sound very PC now, but at the time I was probably just coding until I got a game. And in other words, I didn't sit down and go through any formal design process. I just started writing code basically until something popped out of it. And Bootleg certainly was of that genre. And if anything inspired me, it probably would have been Pac-Man. And I think my screens look very similar to the Pac-Man screens at the time, where you tended to trace around in a horizontal or vertical confinement, mm-hmm. and collecting objects as you went. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The second game I thought a lot more about, and at the time there was, just as there's a scientific puzzle going on today about dark energy and dark matter, at the time in the early 1980s there was a scientific puzzle about the search for weakons, which are subatomic particles related in some way to electromagnetism, and don't ask me to explain what, but I knew they were looking for certain particles, including a Z boson and others, and I put those into a game. And that game, I think, I thought more about, and I also, I think, being the second one, was familiar with the Antic chip and was able to make it look more attractive on the screen.
Now, was the Weakon thing, was that somehow related to your course of study in university?
No, just a general interest, actually. And I probably still am interested in such things, but that was the only time I embodied them into my work.
I liked that in the back of the manual for Weakon, it tells you how to play the game and all the usual stuff, and then at the very end there's kind of like a description of what happens in the real world of subatomic particles, and I didn't understand a word of it, but I love that you included that little educational material.
Oh, fantastic. No doubt I was inspired by reading something like Scientific American at the time, a recent article, and I know they published several on the search for the Wacom at that stage. I'm not sure if it's called Weakon or Wacom, but I went with Weakon.
I went to Wikipedia today to read up on W and Z bosons, and I literally did not understand a thing that I read. So. But the game was okay. So
I have no idea how many people actually bought both of those products. I would imagine it's in the tens of users, or rather than hundreds of users, but I'm hoping someone got the game. My interest was less in playing them, even my own games, and more in writing them.
I played them both today. I really enjoyed Bootleg. I'm terrible at it, but I thought it was a lot of fun. So well done there.
Thank you. You might have inspired me to get one of the emulators going and have another look at it myself. I do remember when the first emulators came out, I put it onto... I had a 32-inch monitor at the time with a lot of resolution, and I put Bootleg onto it, and I think it appeared about the same size as a Matchbox. So presumably there's a way to expand that on the screen.
Yes, you can. The resolution doesn't get any better, but well, it'll take up more space on the screen.
You probably know this better than I. Was it something like 40 pixels or 40 characters by 25, something of that nature?
In the text mode, it was 40 characters wide by 24 high, I believe.
Right, and Bootleg was essentially characters. So
then what happened? So you didn't make any more, or did you make any other games that didn't get published?
I started to write a disc copier, and then I think I just got involved with actual work where I was getting paid, and why I think that Atari experience personally, I pretty much stayed in the computer industry for my working career, and spent the good first 10 years of it as a coder.
Nice.
So that transitioned me at the time. Around about this time, I was offered work in the chemical industry, having been working towards that in university. But the computer business came along, and it was just more appealing.
Do you any chance you still have the source code to those games?
I don't have the source code. I do have two of the APX at the time sent out a finished copy of the game, so I have both of those. But no, I don't have the source code, and there wasn't any way to get it off an Atari system onto anything else at the time. PCs had just started to come into the forefront of business programming.
Right.
And that's where I extrapolated that experience, actually, was to be one of the first or the few in New Zealand who was able to write code for PCs.
So what were you doing? Application software for businesses, or?
Yeah, all sorts of little things, and I guess most of it would have been written in BASIC early on, but then other languages started to come to the fore. COBOL was a big language for the PC here for quite a while, and I don't recall ever seeing any other COBOL PC programmers at the time, so I had a little bit of a head start, I think, and again, that's probably just down to the fact that I picked up on the Atari so quickly.
What do you do today?
I've spent most of my, other than the initial 10 years I spent in coding, I've spent most of it in sales and marketing and in the computer industry. And the most recently would have been quite a long tenure with Hewlett-Packard.
Well, it sounds like you enjoyed your time in front of the Atari, even though as isolated as you may have been there. Seems like it was a pleasant time for you.
It sure was, and I never cease to be amazed that yourself and others have kept this the Atari world alive, which is how I see it from down here. And I've really enjoyed the Antic podcast myself. I've gone through, I would say, most of them. There's quite a bit of time involved, as you're no doubt aware, in putting them all together. And I still can't understand the commercial interest in the Atari world, which I know exists, but it's a puzzle to me. And one day we must talk about that.
Sure.
When I think of folks who have written emulators so that these products can be played on, Apple and PCs and the like, and that's a lot of time involved with very complex code.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think I have what I need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.